I might also remind you that American journalism, all of it, is the best anywhere in the world.
The past few years, there have been several big moments of failure in news media, some of it resulting in defamation lawsuits, and all of it contributing to historically low faith in news media. And we're going to talk about those, but I first want to take you back to a moment in our history when the news in America was far more sensationalist and far more politicized than it is today.
Is that really your idea of how to run a newspaper?
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of.
There's not the slightest proof that this...
Can you prove it isn't?
In the 1890s and 1900s, the news industry was incredibly competitive. Across the U.S., there were more than 20,000 newspapers. That's why they all hired newsboys to scream in your face to buy a newspaper. You can forget about the New York Times, who was towered over by the New York Journal and the New York World. The World and the Journal wrote sensationalist and scandalous stories founded on dubious journalism to drive sales. They'd use eye-popping headlines with harsh language. Known as yellow journalism for a cartoon that the dueling papers used to fight for control over, they're regarded as the chief cause of the Spanish-American War. Their publishers, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, were politically involved, politically ambitious, and their papers were an extension of their political objectives, which all got in the way of the truth. At the time, that was fairly common. Each American city and town had its newspapers that were politically aligned. Americans had to choose whether to read their town's Democrat newspaper or their Republican one, and so there wasn't really a common understanding of the facts. In a lot of ways, we've gone back to that time in American journalism. The bold typeface fonts and the bleeding headlines, the incendiary language, the haphazard journalism, the political alignment, and of course all the money that there is to be made in publishing stories that don't have to face real journalistic scrutiny. Over 100 years ago, we got lucky. It was financially smart for newspapers to combine because of the costs of running a newspaper. So a lot of those Democrat and Republican newspapers actually merged. The Democratic Pittsburgh Post merged with the Pittsburgh Gazette, a Republican newspaper. In Florida, the Democratic Daily Times merged with the Republican Union. At about that time, the Objectivity movement was taking off in journalism, and news consumers stopped reading sensationalist and political newspapers. There's a reason that you've probably never heard of the provocative New York World or the agitating New York Journal, each of which would later go out of business. Broadcast news ended up dominating the 20th century and would be beholden to the Fairness Doctrine. The FCC would implement the Fairness Doctrine by restricting news broadcasters to simply factual reporting, and it all but mandated giving airtime to opposing viewpoints. Walter Cronkite's news on CBS had to be fair as a matter of government regulation. The Fairness Doctrine was abolished in 1987, and that paved the way for conservative talk radio, which is the precursor to today's alternate conservative outlets.
I wanted to show you my printing press. This is the Drudge Report. This little machine.
Here, let me put it over here.
At this point in the history of news media, the political left has responded with their own alternative outlets. Two example stories in either setting just scream of sensationalist journalism. Because it's a bit more recent, let's start with what you may have heard of as the big lie. The charge is that Republican politicians and conservative news outlets peddled an idea that the election would have gone to Trump if there weren't any voter or election fraud. You've probably also heard the phrase that there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud.
But there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. There's no evidence that there's not either. That's the definition.
But if you're a reader of conservative news outlets, that line may do nothing for you. And to understand why, it's helpful to start with the Trump team legal strategy. Trump's lawyers acquired as many of these things called affidavits as humanly possible. An affidavit is a legal word for sworn statement, and you know they were going for quantity over quality because of how flimsy these affidavits ended up being. The Daily Wire ran a story on an unverified affidavit that was later thrown out of court because the person who provided the sworn statement gave very few details, didn't have any corroborating evidence, and didn't actually report any voter fraud allegations until after it was announced that Joe Biden won Michigan. Breitbart reported on a Pennsylvania postal worker who alleged voter fraud, but then recanted his allegations of ballot tampering to federal investigators. If you look closer at the affiants, the people who make these sworn statements, you'll find Republican political activists, QAnon followers, and of course lots of hardcore Trump supporters.
But she never sent us any evidence, despite a lot of requests, polite requests, not a page.
And that's not to mention the voting machine conspiracies, where news outlets are alleged to have wrongly defamed technology companies. One conservative news outlet posted an apology to Dominion Technologies for their coverage. Fox is now being sued for its coverage of another voting machine technology company. It's helpful to think of Trump's voter fraud legal strategy as not being designed to succeed in court where it failed, but to think of it as a political strategy. The strategy wouldn't work politically unless it had news outlets to report on unverified affidavits, which many did. Next thing you know, there was and still is a widely held belief in rampant voter fraud and that Trump was the true winner of the 2020 election. This voter fraud journalism looks a lot like the other example of sensationalist journalism that came to mind. That example is that of the STEELE dossier. The STEELE dossier was the Democrats' opposition research into Donald Trump. The document contained some unverified, salacious, and scandalous allegations about Donald Trump and focused in particular on potential ties to Russia. This sort of document usually doesn't see the light of day. A lot of political campaigns will get opposition research reports on an opponent, but that's typically as far as they go. BuzzFeed News was the outlet to first publish the full document, and for that, they got major backlash.
A long time. But you just published fake news.
But some of the most salacious, unverified talking points still got airtime on online-only and also more established news outlets. BuzzFeed would misreport again and false start on reporting on obstruction of justice in the Russia investigation. They would be debunked all of 2 days later, and after that second mess-up, that was it for BuzzFeed News as we would know it. The website still exists, but it's a shell of its former breaking news self. So this issue is deeper than left or right. Were these two examples of sensationalist journalism equal? Of course not. The surrounding context, including the events of January 6th, make one more scary than the other. The symptom that we're talking about is the running of unverified news. Sometimes there's no evidence to back up a claim, but when more institutional news outlets say that there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud, what they mean is that there's no corroborated evidence of widespread voter fraud. There's no verified evidence of widespread voter fraud. If I told you that Bernie Sanders stole $1 million from me, and then a news outlet wrote a story about Bernie Sanders stealing $1 million, but they put my name in the headline as a source, that would be bad journalism, which is exactly what this voter fraud journalism, and for that matter, the STEELE dossier journalism, looks like. And it'd actually be problematic if it was possible for me to sue Bernie Sanders or to publicly defame him just because I swore in an affidavit that he stole $1 million. David Graham of The Atlantic would call the printing of unverified news an abdication of the basic responsibility of journalism. These outlets have claimed to report unverified news to be transparent with their audiences and give them everything the outlet knows, verified or not, but that becomes a very serious issue when the audience expects that anything from that outlet is indeed verified and corroborated fact. Verification and corroboration aren't magic solutions. If I got a buddy to say that Bernie stole my $1 million, technically my story is corroborated. Journalistic verification is an art.
But you do ignore stories. Would you not agree to that? I mean, Russia's
by design. Yeah.
By design.
Yes,
okay,
on purpose.
Many of these outlets are often surprisingly open about their political objectives. In a 2017 interview, Breitbart news editor-in-chief admitted that Breitbart didn't fully cover Russian meddling in the 2016 election and that was intentional. Maybe unsurprisingly, in 2018, Republican perception of Russia was more positive after that series of cyber attacks than it was when the poll was previously taken in 2014. So if you want to know why there's no common set of facts in America, you have to consider news outlets openly politicizing their reporting. What we're seeing is American news media struggle under the weight of new technologies. The internet has made the news industry just as competitive as it was in the 1890s. That competition leads to the running of stories that historically wouldn't have seen much airtime. Social media, the second largest source of news for Americans, amplifies sensationalist journalism and has made it even more personality and opinion-driven. Cable news, the punching bag for media criticism, created the 24-hour news cycle and now has to fill all that time with non-expert pundits and often a lot of hot air. It also uses a shameless amount of opinion and commentary. Seeing Fox News lose its viewers to Newsmax after the 2020 election is a reminder that cable news is under constant threat from more aggressive upstart outlets. If they don't cover the most sensationalist stories of the day, they take a financial hit. Are there other issues with the news that I didn't mention? Of course, you'll have to subscribe to the context in order to keep up with media criticism that we may do in the future. With the news as democratic as it is today, we do get more voices, but that also comes at the price of truth and accuracy. In the heyday of the New York World and the New York Journal, times were incredibly chaotic, as you can imagine. Hot rhetoric, political violence. News media sowed fear and division in the name of profit. We're in a similar moment in history, and we'll find out later whether we're in the middle of an era of news division or at the end of it.